Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about why you might be wrong about love triangles. And I bring this topic up because I think of all the tropes I've heard about over the last several years, love triangles might be one of the most hated. That one, along with miscommunication. And both of these tropes are usually more popular in romance books or in YA literature. But among adult fantasy fans, especially, they seem to be very, very looked down upon. And I really want to talk about it because I believe that any trope can be done well. Any trope can be executed poorly, or any trope can be executed to perfection. So, when it comes to the love triangle, I first want to say that there are some variations of what a love triangle is. In this case, I'm mainly going with a character has a choice between person A or person B as a love interest, and this causes conflict for that person, or they're conflicted between their feelings for two different people, basically. And I am going to go ahead and give some examples in this particular video. And when I get there, you could skip around so you don't have to spoil yourself. I also want to say a couple of theories about love triangles before I get into this. One is that, with some exceptions, I think that usually a trope is done very well, in my opinion, especially a love triangle, when you don't notice it. So, the exception being something like Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Obviously, that's not a fantasy book, it's a romance book, or actually, rather, a romantic satire of England at that time. And that's why that trope works so well, because the love triangle in Pride and Prejudice works perfectly with the societal themes at the time. It illustrates what England was like at that time, the issues, the challenges, the social expectations for the character. So, I think it just worked brilliantly for doing exactly what Jane Austen was trying to show as far as those themes and bring out those satirical elements. But going into the fantasy books I'm going to be talking about, the love triangle might be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more hidden, because there are other things happening in the story. And the love triangle is not only supporting what's happening in the story, but it's also blended with the bigger themes, the bigger story elements that are happening. So I think that that's when the love triangle is extremely successful. It's not just about a person being in conflict about who will be my next love interest. It's about how those love interests represent different aspects of conflict in the world at large or different societal themes, kind of like Pride and Prejudice again, but in a fantasy way. And so I will explain this as I go on into the books. It's hard to talk about this in an abstract way. So I'm going to give some examples. And again, you could skip around in case you're worried about spoilers. There are actually two love triangles I can identify in the first series I'm going to talk about, but I'm just going to focus on one love triangle in the first book, and that is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham, A Shadow in Summer being the first book. The love triangle is between three teenagers, Ota, Mati, and Liat. So Liat and Ota are in a relationship together. Liat is the female character, and Ota already establishes, even from the beginning of the book, when he's a child, at the very beginning of the book, he establishes that he is somebody who is a very independent thinker. He's somebody who wants to live by his own rules. He has this quote, "There are no locks on hell." And Liat is somebody who's very ambitious. She's very socially minded. She wants Ota to be this ambitious person that she knows he's capable of being while not knowing much about his past. And then there's Mati, and Mati looks up to Ota so much. And this is very consistent to Mati's character. Anytime there's a problem occurring, he immediately thinks, Ota, what would Ota do? We have to find Ota. Ota can solve this. If anybody can do it, Ota can. So he has a little bit of hero worship for Ota. And so what ends up happening is that Liat ends up cheating on Ota with Mati. And this is very unexpected on the part of Liat and Mati, but proximity made that feasible. It made that seem convincing why that would happen. Ota being a little more distant in this part of the story and not playing by Liat's rules, what she wants him to be. And so, even though Ota is the more powerful character and maybe more aligned with what Liat thinks she wants, the devotion that Mati shows as a person, the loyalty he shows, also speaks to her character. So I think that's always common in a love triangle, that the two love interests represent different aspects that we look for in ourselves or that we care about or that the protagonist cares about. But the reason this is such a powerful love triangle and why it's so powerful in the series overall is that these decisions that these characters make regarding their feelings for one another impacts the sense of devotion and friendship and rocks the whole entire dynamic that's going to be occurring throughout the rest of the series. And this is magnified by the fact that Mati is working for a poet. He's training to become a poet to work this magic that has huge ramifications for the nation at large, for the world at large, and so this relationship is a very delicate one, the one that he has with Ota that he's putting at risk. And Ota also this the whole entire dynamic, this whole entire love triangle also affects the trajectory of his whole path ahead and what he chooses to do with his life. And it also affects the relationship and the dynamic of their friendship overall throughout the series. So the interesting thing about this love triangle is it's really zoomed in on the 2 male characters and their friendship rather than the female character and the conflict of who she's going to be with, which is what love triangles, I think, usually do in a more generic sense. In this case, it's really zoomed in on that friendship and what it does to the friendship and how that affects the stakes of the world and the politics at large. And so that's what I think is so powerful about it. And again, I think that proximity played a role in creating this love triangle to happen in the first place, but it really does go deep into the long price of consequences that happen throughout this series, again, tying into some of the bigger themes of the series. One of my favorite love triangles that I've ever read is in Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a flintlock fantasy standalone or a military fantasy following a character named Emily Marshwick, who is conscripted into the military after her kingdom is sorely losing a war. The soldiers have been weakened to such an extent that they end up having to draft women. So once she has been deployed, she finds herself in an enemies to lovers situation with a mayor governor character. She's trading letters back and forth with this character. This is somebody who worked with her father. He's described as having a mocking smile, being a loathsome character. And yet she finds that through these letters, she can confide in him. And meanwhile, she ends up in close proximity with a king's warlock who is closer to her age, who seems to be the better type for her in some ways. But what makes it so brilliant is the way that the mayor governor character, who she's trading letters with, and the warlock character, the way that they represent different things about loyalty to people who are close to you, to your country at large, your kingdom at large, and also the themes of propaganda, of whether defeat is the more noble cause in a war. And there are so many bigger things that are happening again in the politics of the story. And of course, what it's saying about women in the military and the men, they play a central role in that as far as what Emily is experiencing, what they represent to her represents some of those larger themes. And yet, the way that this wraps up is it's so brilliant, in my opinion. It has one of the most satisfying conclusions to a standalone I've ever read, and it subverts some tropes in some ways, I think, as far as gender representation is concerned. And again, I love the way this love triangle perfectly worked with the character development, yes, but also the themes at large, the plot of the story. So many of the elements were just perfectly cohesive with that love triangle, and it had such a satisfying ending that I did not expect. The Prince of Nothing trilogy by R. Scott Baker has one of those love triangles that I personally didn't even identify when I was reading the series, and I think that has to do with how convincing Baker is with his characters. I found his characters incredibly fascinating. They struggle quite a bit. There's questionable agency in this story as it does deal with free will as well as some other metaphysical questions about consciousness. But that's also part of what made this love triangle so compelling as well. And again, why it blended in so well because it blended in with those aspects of the story. So we have Esmenet, who's a prostitute in this world. Women do not have a lot of agency. They usually can only be prostitutes at best in this world, and they're usually seen as over the hill beyond the age of 30. So Esmenet does not have it good in this world, and Akamian has been her source of stability. He's a wizard magician in this world. He also doesn't have it very easy, but they find stability in one another in their relationship with one another, which hasn't been the easiest relationship. but it works and it feels convincing as two characters who are not young, they're not naive, but they understand each other. They get each other in a world that's very difficult, that's very uncomfortable. And then we have this mysterious Dunyan character, Kelus, who's able to read people's thoughts through studying the micro expressions or micro muscles of the face. And he's a grand manipulator. Now, when he comes into the picture and he seduces Esminette, that whole entire love triangle, Esmenet, Akamian, and Kelus, this really comes to the forefront, I think, in book two, The Warrior Prophet. Again, I think that the reason it was so convincing, it was so believable, is because of, again, proximity. Proximity does seem to play a big role when it comes to these love triangles. Akamian is not around whenever Kelus is seducing Esmenet. And I think he is believed to be dead at this point, and so Esmenet ends up falling for Kelus, and Kelus is able to manipulate her. He's able to say the right things, read her the right way, and again, because this series goes so deep into that question, if somebody can read every micro expression on your face and know all the tricks and can manipulate you, do you have free will? I mean, that's one way that the series is looking at that question. But another layer to that is again how women are treated so poorly due to the patriarchy of the society, and Kelus gives her a way out. He shows her another way of seeing herself, which is something that this character would desperately want or desire. There are so many layers to Esmenet's character, but to me, it made sense exactly how she would be manipulated in this particular circumstance. It was not comfortable to read about that manipulation, but it ends up happening. She ends up being with Kelus while at the same time having feelings for Akamian, and that turns into a really ugly situation. But it's an ugly situation where it all perfectly works again because of those things that Baker is exploring. And Akamian's search for agency also it's also important. I feel like this entire love triangle, this entire dynamic is very instrumental in motivating him to take certain paths that he takes in the series. So for me, it was absolutely perfectly executed, very hard to read about, very uncomfortable. I didn't feel like I was necessarily rooting for anybody in this relationship in this world or any relationship in this world, but I understood it at the same time on some level, and it was truly fascinating to read about, considering again some of the metaphysical questions and some of the questions at large it's asking. Now that I've talked about a rather disturbing, ugly love dynamic in the Prince of Nothing trilogy by R. Scott Baker, I'm going to pivot and talk about a love triangle I found beautiful, and that's the one in The Lines of Al-Rassan by Guy Gavriel Kay. And like Baker's series, the characters in The Lines of Al-Rassan are aged up. They're mature characters. They are not teenagers. And honestly, I didn't even identify that this was a love triangle or that trope, except that I had messaged Jenny Wirtz on Twitter because I knew this was a very special book to her. It's one of her favorite books. And so I wanted to know why she loved this book. And she shared with me many reasons why she loved The Lions of Al-Rassan, but she also happened to mention the very subtle love triangle in it. And once she said that, it completely created a light bulb moment for me because, yes, of course, there is a love triangle in this book. I just didn't quite see it. The love triangle in this particular book is really special because the characters are mature, in my opinion. I mean, they still have a lot of passion. They still have a lot of gumption, but they still have an awareness of life, an awareness of love being dynamic and, I don't know, just an openness to things that made this love triangle beautiful, in my opinion. These 3 characters I'm talking about are Jahane or Jahan, however you say that, a female physician character. There is Rodrigo Belmont, who is the captain character, the El Cid character in this story, as it is based on Spanish history. And we also have a character named Ahmad Kairan. These 3 characters come from 3 different cultures, 3 different religions, and yet they have a chemistry when they meet. They have a chemistry with each other. All 3 of them have a chemistry with one another, and it's not an instant an insta love necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily call it that. I guess there is instant chemistry between two of them, between Kairan and and Jahan. Perhaps there is a case for that, but it still felt like it developed over the course of the book. The three characters developing feelings for each other felt like such a natural progression. It felt so easy and natural, even though Rodrigo is married. He's married to a beautiful woman named Miranda, and they also have a very passionate, wonderful marriage. But I think that part of the story is how you can love two people at the same time, and it doesn't detract from the love you have for one person doesn't necessarily detract from your love for another person. And yet, it's not promoting open relationships or three-way relationships by any means. Characters do choose, and I feel like they make the right choice for themselves and their situation. I think it works out overall for all of them, but it's there's a lot to say about that too. The end is quite emotional. But at the same time, I think it's beautiful the way they do come from different backgrounds, as I mentioned, and the way that love unites them, the way that they're able to find those connections. And there's conflict too. There's definitely conflict still. It's not so simple. There's a lot of layers to it, but it was just so beautifully handled. Again, it blended into the story perfectly. It blended into the larger themes of this story. And again, if you want to hear more, I do have a spoiler-free review. I love this book, loved the relationship dynamics. And again, it wasn't one that I would have noticed otherwise if Jenny Wirtz hadn't pointed it out. So that concludes my thoughts on love triangles and why I thought they were so effective in these books. Again, I think that these relationship dynamics they supported the larger story elements, they supported the themes, they didn't detract from the story. I think that's when people don't usually like love triangles is when it feels like it's an add-on and not blended into why we're here, what the purpose is, when characters show that they're more interested in who they sleep with or who they end up with rather than saving the world. I hear that all the time as well. But I think that it worked so well in each of the books I mentioned here today. So please let me know if you've read any of these books and if you would agree. And if you read any of these, were you able to identify when you were reading them that they were, in fact, love triangles? Or were you like me? And it was more after the fact that you started to notice that was the case? And your thoughts on love triangles overall. If you have any recommendations of books that do love triangles right, please let me know in the comment section below because I'd love to hear from you. And also be mindful of spoilers in case I haven't read the book or anybody else hasn't read the book, but I would love to hear from you. Please consider liking this video if you liked this video and consider subscribing if you enjoy content like this. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.